Welcome to our RekPlay video series. This lesson is going to go into MTP, or Mass Transfusion Protocol. This is one of my most favorite things to teach in the emergency department, and actually this is one of my most favorite things to do whenever I'm in trauma. I love to be assigned as the blood person and work the machine. So let's jump right into what exactly MTP is and what it also isn't. So what exactly is MTP? What does it stand for? So Mass Transfusion Protocol, MTP, is when we rapidly replace major blood loss during an emergency. But that is not all of what MTP is. So when people think of this, they think we're just throwing in bags of this packed red blood cells, or these big red blood bags, and we're just pushing them in. We are not. It is a lot more than that. So why is MTP beyond giving blood quickly? Mass Transfusion Protocol is making sure that we're giving the right type of blood products in the right proportions to our patients and their current situation or their need to stabilize them. So if we think about when MTP could be utilized, which we're going to talk about here in a second, we could have somebody that's had a long-term bleed. Maybe they've been chronically bleeding, and this has been because of a GI bleed, or maybe because of a woman's cycle, and this has been a rather long one, and they've chronically been bleeding over a longer period of time. We also have the kind of bleeding where it could be trauma, and maybe somebody unfortunately would have their arm severed off, or maybe there is an artery or a vein that's nicked and they're losing blood acutely or rapidly. So when do we activate this MTP? Well, this of course is going to be facility dependent. So not every facility is going to activate their MTP protocols the same. It's not a standard national kind of thing. You have to make sure that you understand your hospital's protocol, but typically we're going to activate MTP in 3 different kinds of ways. So one is usually whenever about 6 to 10 units are going to be expected to be given within 24 hours. Additionally, we can activate MTP when there's greater than 3 units that are planned to be given within 1 hour. And we can activate this when we see blood loss that is greater than 60% in a matter of 3 hours. So how can we think of a situation like this? Well, if we think about all of our RekPlay stuff we've been talking about, when we talk about our chest tubes, that's something too. So if we have a hemothorax and we put that chest tube in, we're going to initially see that blood output, and we're going to mark it on our chest tube drainage chamber. But if we come back in and we see that in a half hour, they've had another 200 mLs of blood, and then a half hour later, they have another 200 to 300 mLs of blood, they are still losing a lot of blood in this lung. So even though it's over this 3-hour window of time, this is where we need to raise the red flag, get them to the OR, and we can expect that we're going to be giving them a lot of blood. So why is MTP most importantly all about proportions? So from this point on, when you hear MTP, I want you to think proportions. I don't always want you to think we're just throwing in a lot of blood. So let's break down why. If we take a look at this patient here, he's got a pretty big bleed from a car accident here on his shoulder, but he is bleeding whole blood. So we want to remember that whole blood consists of 3 groups. So our first group here is going to be the red stuff. This is our PRBCs. And our red blood cells carry oxygen to the tissues and remove our carbon dioxide. And we've learned all about this through our RekPlay series. They also maintain oxygen delivery to keep everything perfused. Whole blood is also made up of platelets, and our platelets help form clots to stop bleeding. These guys help manage or prevent more bleeding. Whole blood is also made up of our FFP. This is our fresh frozen plasma, and this is liquid that helps carry proteins and cells. So this FFP has clotting and protein factors that are for clotting and volume. And down here below our FFP, we actually have something else, and this is called cryoprecipitate. So this cryo is rich in clotting factors, and this comes from plasma. and this is especially in fibrogen. So this is our final steps for clotting. So this cryoprecipitate is going to be also equally important in our MTP. So now that we know that this whole blood consists of these three components, we're going to break this down in another visual way. So if we think of our whole blood, we can think of it like this cake here. And if we take a look at the slice of cake, we can see that this cake has a few components to make it what it is. First, we have this cake part. So this is that fluffy cake color, the red, and that structure inside of it. So we can actually think of this as our RBCs, or those red blood cells that are carrying oxygen to our tissues and also helping us expel our CO2. We have this lemon sponge cake that's in between, and this is helping us hold the cake together. So this is like our platelets here that are helping our blood clot and prevent more bleeding. And on top of these two, this is the vanilla cream here. This is actually our FFP, that fresh frozen plasma. So this layer is keeping our cake very moist and delicious. And just like the FFP is going to provide essential clotting factors and proteins to maintain the blood's functionality. So if we don't have any of these layers of our cake, then we're not going to have a full and delicious cake. So again, when we think of MTP, we want to think proportions. So it is extremely important that our patients receive an appropriate ratio. So this patient here above in the car accident that has some bleeding that's coming out of that shoulder neck area, if we just go and put a whole bunch of RBCs in there, then we're missing these clotting factors. And if we put in more clotting factors, we either, one, could have too much clotting, or we don't have a substantial amount of blood volume, or we don't have enough red blood cells to carry oxygen around to our tissues. So how do we know what this ratio should look like? Well, we can do two different ways. And again, this is going to be very facility dependent. But there is a ratio that's known as your 1:1:1. This will be your plasma, platelets, and your blood. We can also have a 1:1:2. This is plasma, platelets, blood, blood. So what this is saying is that for every 2 units of blood, we're giving 1 plasma, 1 platelet. And again, in some facilities, for every unit of blood, some facilities want a platelets or they want plasma. And most MTP include additional cryo, that cryoprecipitate. They want 10 units or potentially cryo of 4 grams. So this isn't it. So just because we are completing our whole blood, there's still typically stuff that we want to give or remember or do when we're in the middle of something like an MTP situation in our patient. So we want to get familiar with these terms. Our TXA, or our tranexamic acid, so this is an antifibrinolytic, or this is a clot promoter. So this reduces the mortality if we give this within 3 hours of bleeding, but after 3 hours, this can increase mortality due to clotting. So for example, on scene, if a patient is in a car accident and maybe their arm is half severed off or severed off, our EMTs or our medics sometimes will give that TXA while our patient is en route. But it's important to know the exact time that this car accident happened. Or let's say that we find a patient and they've been down for a while with no witnesses. We don't have any understanding of whenever this bleeding occurred or something occurred, or maybe they've been hemorrhaging from potentially having a miscarriage, but we're unsure when this hemorrhage started, and they haven't hemorrhaged enough that they're losing all of their blood volume. But we want to make sure that we're aware of when we're having this massive blood loss, because again, after that 3-hour window, it shows that the mortality severely climbs if we give this TXA after that 3-hour mark. When we give TXA, we usually dose this of 1 gram over 10 minutes, and then we do 1 gram in 8 hours after. A lot of times in trauma centers, we'll hang this while we're running up to the OR. Or if you are the person documenting the trauma, it's important for you to always ask the medics or listen for the medics to say if they've already given this TXA en route. Another term we hear with our MTP is going to be this albumin, and this helps create more plasma in our blood. So in MTP, it maintains blood volume and pressure by increasing oncotic pressure of the blood, helping to retain fluid and prevent edema. And what does this mean, this oncotic pressure? Well, this is meaning that this albumin is actually helping keep the water inside the blood vessel. So we don't want to have any of that volume go outside of the vessel, because the vessel is what's going to help keep that blood and the volume to our heart, to our lungs. So if our heart doesn't have enough volume to pump around in its chambers, things are going to go bad. So we want to make sure that we're giving this to help with that plasma and that volume expansion, so we do have enough to keep perfusing to the good stuff, our main organs. Lastly, this word here, calcium. Why is calcium so important when it comes to MTP? Well, you might already know about this because of learning about giving blood. But calcium is important because citrate is used in stored blood products, and this can actually bind to calcium. So this can cause hypocalcemia. And so by giving calcium, this is going to help counteract this effect. So this citrate that's in our blood product can take away some of our calcium, and then we can have problems too. So if we think about it, if we're giving a lot of blood products, that means we're going to have more of it trying to pull this calcium out. So we want to make sure that we're replacing or giving that calcium. And lastly, we have this fancy little machine over here. This is one of my best friends in the ER. I love this machine. This is called a level 1 rapid infuser or transfuser. This is a device that ministers blood or IV fluids quickly. We can use this to warm our fluid to prevent hypothermia. And if we remember in trauma, that a cold trauma patient is actually really bad. We want to make sure that we keep our trauma patients warm, because then we can get into that whole trauma triad of death, which we don't want. So we want to make sure we keep our patients warm. Also, when it is in the winter season, and maybe if we have some homeless that are outside and they come in and they are just frozen to the core, or if we have somebody with a near drowning and they're also frozen, we can use this machine to help warm up our fluids and really replace that fluid volume with some warm fluids. This requires a minimum of an 18 gauge or larger, and also is really great if we have a central line. Of course, we're not always so lucky. Examples of a rapid transfuser is going to be this machine here, this level 1, or maybe even a Belmont. And quick little pop quiz here, true or false, you must have a certification to run this machine. This is very false. This is typically just an in training or having someone beside you teach you how to utilize this machine. It's usually pretty easy to learn. The biggest problem with this machine is that if you're not constantly using it, you kind of don't always remember how to set up that tubing, or even what exactly you're programming on something like the Belmont, although it's very friendly to use. So it's always great to learn from someone, but the best part or best advice I can give is be right next to the person running the machine in the middle of chaos, so you don't have to be worrying and having that adrenaline make you lose focus on what you're doing. And you can also watch how people in trauma are going to track the number of bags that they're giving. So when you're someone that's maybe running this machine, I think my max is 36 bags on someone that had a liver laceration. And the recorder also, because you're talking in the middle of trauma, if you get done transfusing a unit of blood on this machine, you need to yell out that that unit is in, putting next unit up. You're going to yell this out to the room. When you hit that unit and it's running and you flip the switch, you want to let people know next unit is running, and that way somebody can also be writing this down and keeping it tracked for you, so we're able to still give the appropriate ratio that we want to give. This concludes our MTP lesson. Let me know in the comments what you thought. If there's anything I missed or anything that you think helps whenever you have MTP activation, I will see you in the next one.